back in time, in the year 2003, Professor Dr. Zbigniew Jaworowski, a world-renowned atmospheric scientist and mountaineer who has excavated ice out of 17 glaciers on 6 continents in a 50 years career, warned in his paper "The Ice Age is Coming" that according to the observed average duration of the warm periods between the ice ages, the end of the current warm period has already been exceeded by 500 years. He points out in the paper that the transition to the next ice age is near and may have already started, and he warns that the phase shift between the cold and warm climate phases is dramatically short. He suggests that a transition phase may be as short as 50 years, or 20, or even 1 to 2 years, and that the phase shift to the next ice age can start virtually without warning. Jaworowski points out in his 2003 paper that scientists at the Solar Terrestrial Institute in Irkutsk, in Siberia, have reported a sharp downwards trend in annual average temperatures beginning in 1998, measured on the ground by the Institute. The average annual air temperature in Irkutsk, which correlates well with the average annual global temperature of the surface air, has reached its maximum of 2.3 degrees Celsius in 1997, and then began to drop to 1.2 degrees Celsius in 1998, and to 0.7 degrees in 1999, and to 0.4 degrees in the year 2000. That the measured trend is still continuing is evident in numerous other types of physical measurements. Jaworowski cited the measurements as an example that a big phase shift had begun that should not be ignored. But this was all he could say back in 2003. It was simply not possible then to say more, even by renowned scientists as himself, because the ice age dynamics were not correctly understood at the time for the lack of available data. Great research efforts were in progress, though, at this time, with results being produced that stand poised to dramatically expand our perception of the ice age dynamics. Several gigantic scientific research efforts were presenting data, both in space and on the ground, which opened up a new window on the dynamics that cause ice ages and their severity. Until this data became known, the most advanced ice age theory, which had been widely hailed at the time, was the Milankovitch cycles theory. But this theory was eventually recognized to be a false concept. The Milankovitch cycles theory proposed that ice ages result from the combined effect of minute cyclical variations of the tilt of the spin axis of the Earth, its orientation, and the eccentricity of the Earth's orbit around the Sun. These were observed to have very long cycle times, ranging from 26,000 years to 100,000 years. While these cyclical variations cause minute variations in hemispheric and seasonal distribution of the solar energy received on Earth, The theory became later sight when the recognition dawned that the total energy received from the sun remains always the same regardless of the variations of the tilt of the Earth's spin axis and the eccentricity of the Earth's orbit around the sun. The theory became increasingly a dead issue the more it was recognized that the sun itself is the variable factor in the climate dynamics on Earth. Measurements of historic carbon-14 values make this fact rather plain. In this illustration, the plotted carbon-14 ratios stand as an inverse proxy for solar activity intensity. Since the carbon-14 isotope is the product of primarily solar cosmic-ray-flux colliding with atmospheric nitrogen, the ratio of the abundance of this isotope becomes a measurable proxy for the intensity of solar activity in historic times. This ratio tells us with measurable certainty that the global warming of the Earth from the end of the Little Ice Age till modern time was caused by the massive upramping of the sun rather than by human activity. This proves that the sun is an immensely variable factor that affects the climate on Earth. The proof is further supported by the upramping of the sunspot cycles, for which continuous historic data exists. Almost no sunspots had been visible for decades during the Maunder minimum of the Little Ice Age, the coldest period in recent history. Then, suddenly, the sunspot cycles started up again in a big way, which is the result of dramatically increased solar activity, which by its timing is coincident with the warming of the Earth. Thus both the carbon-14 ratios as a proxy for solar activity and the sunspot numbers tell us unmistakably that the sun is a highly variable star that varies the climate on Earth. Another cosmogenic proxy for solar activity is the isotope Beryllium-10. It is a radioactive isotope that is formed almost exclusively by cosmic ray interaction with oxygen atoms in the atmosphere. Its relatively long half-life of 1.3 million years gives it a long residence time before decaying into boron. Boron is one of the rare atomic elements that is produced entirely by cosmic ray spallation instead of by the normal path of stellar nucleosynthesis. Boron is also an essential component for life on Earth, including human life and plant life. Since the beryllium-10 that decays into boron has its origin in the interaction of solar cosmic ray flux in the atmosphere, its ratio serves as a perfect measurement for historic solar activity. The resulting beryllium measurements give us a third body of proof that the great global warming that began almost 300 years ago was exclusively the result of the massive upramping of the sun during this period. This threefold proof should be sufficient for the recognition that our sun is a highly variable star. As a proxy for solar activity, the changing beryllium ratio also tells us that the regular 11-year solar cycles that are normally evident as sunspot cycles had continued throughout the Maunder minimum of the Little Ice Age, but too faint in intensity for the sunspot cycles to appear. Another critical factor that the beryllium ratio presents is the immensely sharp upturn in the recovery of the Sun that terminates the Little Ice Age. It needs to be noted here that the beryllium ratios, like the carbon-14 ratios shown previously, are inversely plotted, because low solar activity causes high volumes of cosmic-ray-flux that generates high ratios of the proxy isotopes. This means in simple terms that when the Sun had been going strong, its surrounding plasma sphere had been dense, so that much of the solar cosmic-ray flux had been absorbed by it. This resulted in lower cosmic ray volume and consequently lower isotope ratios. By the same principle, whenever the Sun had been weak, with a less dense plasma sphere around it, greater volumes of cosmic ray flux had been escaping, which had resulted in greater isotope ratios. The ratios were preserved in historic deposits. The inverse plotting is used to compensate for the inverse relationship between solar activity and cosmic ray flux that is reflected in the isotope ratios. This practice is typical for presenting cosmogenic proxies, which makes the result highly illustrative and its significance more recognizable. The result is important because it illustrates that the general decline in solar activity through to the late 1600s had caused the solar activity to become so weak in the late 1600s that we may have nearly lost the interglacial climates with the final phase shift to the full ice age. We had come this close. When Jaworowski suggested in his 2003 paper, based on his own discoveries, that the end of the interglacial period is 500 years overdue, he was likely unaware of how close we had been to it in the late 1600s. The scientific data for this recognition apparently didn't exist at the time. The reason for this lack of recognition, which still continues, is that the Sun's generated light and heat emissions are maintained by a strong regulating principle in the Sun's operation that compensates effectively for input fluctuations. The regulating system is so efficient that the 11 years solar activity cycles, measured as sunspot cycles, maintain the solar surface temperature at a near constant level, within a fraction of a % in radiated energy. The fluctuating sunspot numbers, fluctuating cosmic ray flux, and the fluctuating solar wind pressure are telltale evidence that big changes are happening in the background, in the overall system that generates the sunlight. These telltale measurements that let us measure the upramping of the Sun from the Little Ice Age onward also enable us to measure the now rapidly unfolding down-ramping of the solar activity and its progression towards the startup of the next Ice Age glaciation period. In order to explore the great variable factor that the Sun obviously is, a gigantic space project had been started up in the 1970s to place an orbiter in a polar orbit around the Sun. Its purpose was to observe the Sun outside the ecliptic and to measure all the key elements of solar activity there in an undisturbed part of space. Near the ecliptic, the solar effects are dramatically distorted by the heliospheric current sheet that connects the heliosphere with the Sun along the plane of the ecliptic. Outside the ecliptic, however, the measurements are clean. In order to make these clean measurements, the 35-year-long Ulysses space mission was started up as a joint effort by NASA and the European Space Agency. After the mission had been designed, and one of the two planned spacecraft had actually been built, the pioneering spacecraft was sent on its way in the year 1990. It was a pioneering achievement indeed, in every respect. It was carried through to completion in spite of funding cuts, mission curtailments, and two major delays in launching the craft with the US Space Shuttle system. The spacecraft that was launched in 1990 had been built by the European Space Agency. It was one of the two that had been planned. The American twin had been cancelled in 1981 during troublesome political times in the USA. It may have been the result of the dedication, hopes, and struggles by many concerned scientists that the mission had finally proceeded at all. In hindsight, by the results obtained, the evidently great efforts that had kept the mission going had been fully justified. The extensive instrumentation that was carried by Ulysses had revealed some major surprises in solar dynamics during the course of its 3 orbits around the Sun, until the spacecraft began to fail. The greatest surprise, however, was brought home during the 3rd orbit. The surprise was that during the 10 years between the 1st and 3rd orbits, the measured solar dynamics had dramatically diminished. The solar wind pressure had diminished by 30%. The solar magnetic field likewise had diminished by 30%, and correspondingly the solar cosmic-ray-flux had increased by 20%. These are enormously large numbers for such a short period on the cosmic time scale. The numbers tell us that the great phase shift had indeed begun that Jaworowski had suspected in his paper in 2003, in which he cited the massive diminishing of the on-the-ground air temperature measurements in Siberia. The measurements by Ulysses give us an unexpected, stark view of the beginning of the first phase of the Ice Age startup. If one projects this beginning forward, past the 2008 time frame when the Ulysses mission was shut down, it becomes apparent that the solar wind pressure will reach the 0 mark in 2030, which thereby ends the first major phase of the Ice Age startup. We are presently at the 45% mark on this slope to zero. That comprises the first phase of the Ice Age transition, the phase of the diminishing solar wind. Why is this significant? It is significant because the first phase, as slowly as it is unfolding, and this almost imperceptibly, may be the longest phase of the three-phase process. The point is that we are almost halfway through this first phase without the slightest intention on our part to react to what we see unfolding before our very eyes. We react as if it isn't happening, as if the current interglacial period will last another 1,000 years. The second phase begins after the sunspot cycles no longer happen and the solar wind diminishes to the near zero level. That's when the radiated solar energy itself will begin to diminish. At this point, while the sun is becoming colder, another little ice age will begin on Earth with gradually increasing severity. This second phase will end when the primal fields collapse that focus interstellar plasma onto the sun. At this point, the third phase will happen, and the Ice Age begins. When the primal fields collapse, the sun becomes no longer supercharged with a dense sphere of plasma around it. It then falls back to the lower default state that is typical for the then prevailing background density of unfocused interstellar plasma. This means that the current solar surface temperature of 5,800 degrees Kelvin will diminish to the near 4,000 degrees mark within a short period of time. This results in 70% less solar energy being radiated. This third phase shift will unfold rapidly and set the stage for the next 90,000 years glaciation period. The result will be a deep freeze that no one in living memory has experienced or can even imagine. Ice core records indicate that the little ice age of the 1600s was brought on by a half a degree cooling in global temperature. In comparison, the glaciation environment promises a 15-degree cooling on average in global average temperatures, with lows up to 20 degrees colder. This adds up to 40 times the amount of cooling that was experienced during the Little Ice Age. And that's unimaginably huge. This is big. This is what we need to get ready for. Science tells us that we have little time remaining for it. We should see it as a time to repent from doing nothing. To do nothing is the current commitment. On a scale of the glacial record from the Greenland ice sheet, the current interglacial climate is comparable to the crest of a heat wave. The consequences are hard to imagine when, by the third phase shift, the Earth falls back into deep glaciation conditions. But will this actually happen? As I said before, the carbon-14 ratios indicate that the world had already been experiencing extremely low solar activity during the Little Ice Age, with almost no sunspot seen for nearly a century. This qualifies the Little Ice Age as a Phase 2 example. The baseline in solar activity had been gradually diminishing towards this point. The Sun might also have been operating by then at a slightly lower surface temperature than today's 5,800 degrees Kelvin. This means that we might have drifted precariously close to the final phase shift into glaciation at this time, that no one was prepared for and very few people would have survived. How close we came in this shift towards glaciation will never be known. As it was, humanity was spared this fate that no one had been ready for. Humanity was saved by a sudden and powerful upramping of the Sun. If the great upramping of the Sun hadn't happened, that had pulled us away from the abyss, the end of the interglacial period would have come at this time. It would have taken everyone by surprise and killed almost all of humanity. No one had been prepared for a climate change on the scale of a full ice age. No one could have even imagined such a thing to be possible. The relevant discoveries hadn't been made at the time. The great upramping of the Sun fortunately saved us from all that, perhaps just barely. When Jaworowski notes in his 2003 paper, The Ice Age is Coming, that the end of the interglacial is already 500 years overdue, he might not have suspected the cause for the delay. No one could have seen in those days what had pulled the Earth out of the Little Ice Age in the 1600s. The critical discovery for this recognition hadn't been made at the time, back in 2003. The big discoveries wouldn't become possible until after the North Greenland Ice Core project had been completed, and its samples dated in 2004, and then had been further explored. The cause for the upramping of the Sun that had pulled the Earth away from the potential deep ice age starting up in the 1600s was likely one of the Dansgaard-Oeschger events that had been discovered earlier, but had been ignored as a possible anomaly until they were confirmed by the North Greenland drilling project. The Dansgaard-Oeschger events are climate oscillations that have pulled the Earth periodically out of the deep glacial conditions throughout the last ice age, at intervals of 1,470 years, until the conditions that caused the events became exhausted and the deep cooling began anew. These events are evidently solar events caused by resonance features in the interstellar plasma system of a type that periodically reactivates the Sun's primal fields for a short duration that focus plasma onto the Sun. If one projects the Dansgaard-Oeschger oscillations forward from known occurrences, it becomes apparent that the recovery of the Sun from the Little Ice Age was most likely caused by one of the still continuing Dansgaard-Oeschger events, as faint as they may be. The similarity that we see in comparing the Beryllium-10 proxy for the solar activity with the beginning of the Dansker-Oeschger events in the Greenland ice core symbols is amazing. We see the same fast and steep recovery of the sun in both cases. The example of the Dansker-Oeschger event shown here is a composite of data from two different drilling sites. It also appears that the great cosmic event that had rescued the Earth in the 1600s ran out of steam at the end of the 1990s, by which the reversal to the big global cooling began anew. That is now progressing. The similarity is scary because if it had been a Dansker-Oeschger event that had recovered the sun in the early 1700s, we can't count on this happening again. The next Dansker-Oeschger event isn't due for another 1,000 years and more. Most likely we will see the presently ongoing diminishing of the sun to continue as steeply as it presently is happening until the sun's primal fields fail, whereby the next deep glaciation period begins. Another major item of evidence that Zbigniew Jaworowski couldn't have seen is the evidence provided by the Ulysses spacecraft that had been observing the sun for 15 years from a polar orbit around it until 2008. The Ulysses spacecraft was designed to measure the solar wind characteristics in the entire space around the sun, and this in a polar orbit outside the ecliptic, because the solar winds are dramatically affected by the heliospheric current sheet that pervades the ecliptic space. Outside of it, clean solar wind readings were obtained. The Ulysses spacecraft observed the sun for almost 3 complete orbits. From this, as I said before, a great surprise emerged. It was discovered that the solar wind pressure had diminished by 30% during the 10 years interval between the first and third orbits. This reduction is enormous for such a short period on the cosmic scale, and that's the critical factor for today. Ulysses tells us with its measurements that at the observed rate of diminishing, the solar winds will cease at the early 2030s. This cutoff projection is significant because of the nature of the solar wind. Seen in simplistic terms, the solar wind is comparable to steam being boiled off from a heated kettle. When the heat is increased, the water in the kettle does not get hotter than the boiling point, so that the additional energy input turns more water into steam. When the flame becomes reduced, then, a point will be reached at which no more steam is generated. If the energy input is reduced still further, the water gets colder. The same happens on the sun. When the energy input into the sun is reduced by a lower density plasma flowing into it, a threshold point is reached at which the solar winds cease. After that, the sun itself begins to diminish. This makes the solar wind cutoff point an extremely critical point, as it signals the start of the second phase of the Ice Age startup sequence, the phase of the diminishing sun. It appears that the solar wind cutoff is a critical marker between the high-temperature stars and low-temperature stars. High-temperature stars, like Fomalhaut, appear crisply outlined when seen with telescopes. The reason for this may be that strong solar winds carry the star's fusion products, its synthesized atomic elements, far away from the star. Low-temperature stars, in comparison, which operate at and below 4000 degrees surface temperature, tend to have the fusion products that are created on the surface hanging around them like a cloud of fog because of the absence of solar winds that would otherwise purge their atmosphere. Because of these differences, the 0 point in solar wind pressure marks a critical point that opens the door to the second phase of the Ice Age startup process, beyond which the solar fusion process itself begins to diminish, and with it the solar surface temperature. At which point in time the primal fields will collapse cannot be determined, which then no longer focus high-density plasma onto the Sun. The principles of the primal fields have been extensively researched. They are dynamic electromagnetic structures that require a minimal rate of plasma flow to form and to exist. When the minimal threshold is crossed for the primal fields to function, the Sun will likely fall back to a lower level, a type of unaided state of solar activity, which would lower its surface temperature to roughly 4000 degrees, with 70% less energy being radiated. The Ulysses project thus raises the bar for us by illustrating with concrete measurements that the solar collapse point is far closer at hand than anyone had dared to imagine before. The amazing speed of the ongoing collapse of the solar system should jolt us out of the easy chair. It may do this someday. The second amazing discovery that the Ulysses mission brought home is that it proved, to as much as it is possible, that the Sun is externally powered by high-density plasma streams being focused onto it. The proof is located in the void that is reported in the solar wind measurements over each of the Sun's polar regions. The voids are located exactly where one would expect the plasma connection to be located, from the primal fields to the Sun. High-power electric discharge experiments conducted at the Los Alamos National Laboratory produced a unique magnetically self-aligned phenomenon generated by the flow of electric particles. When one superimposes the experiment-derived geometry onto the radial graph of the Ulysses measurements, the voids in the measurements coincide with the experimental result of the plasma flow experiment. Thus Ulysses shows us what no one may have expected before, that the Sun is a plasma star. The plasma which flows through the voids onto the Sun is the endpoint feature of the interstellar plasma streams, for which the solar system as a whole serves as a node point. Node points form when the self-pinching effect of plasma streams reach a point when the concentrated magnetic fields break down, causing the concentrated plasma to blow out, typically onto a Sun that consumes a portion, which enables the rest then to flow on. Our Sun is thereby brought to light as an electric star, and the solar system as an electrically powered phenomenon that responds to external fluctuations. When we are looking for the cause of climate fluctuations, this is where we find the answers and the evidence, and we have a lot of evidence to digest. We have found threefold hard evidence that the 300 years of global warming out of the Little Ice Age was caused by the sun. We see clear evidence for it in the carbon-14 ratios shown here. And we see corresponding evidence for the upramping of the sun in the Beryllium-10 ratios. And we see the evidence also in increasing sunspot numbers. Furthermore, we see also threefold evidence that the operation of the sun is presently diminishing in a near freefall collapse fashion. We see the collapse happening in the measurements from the Ulysses mission. We also see the same fast collapse happening in the diminishing sunspot numbers and in the corresponding increase in coronal holes that tell the same story. We even see the dramatic weakening evident in the diminishing magnetic pole deflection. In a strong solar system, the magnetic primal fields for the sun cause a 23-degree magnetic pole deflection according to the tilt of the axis of the Earth. This deflection began to diminish in the early 1900s. This diminishment accelerated massively near the end of the 1900s, when the solar collapse phase began. This means that we have three fundamentally different types of evidence too for the collapse process, with all of them telling the same story, that the sun system is in a near free-fall collapse phase that promises to end with the startup of the next ice age in the near future, possibly in the 2050s. So, where do we go from here? We are at the 45% mark of the first phase of the collapse process. Shouldn't we begin by acknowledging that the discoveries that we had made are real, and that the evidence that supports them is likewise real, and that the time has come to react to them? Obviously, the Ice Age startup response in society should begin here. This train should begin with society acknowledging the variable sun as a reality that responds to changing conditions located outside the solar system itself in interstellar space. All climate changes that we experience on Earth, small and big, including the massive ice ages in the past that have become the norm during the last 2 million years, are evidently rooted externally in interstellar space. No evidence exists that the cause for the ice age is located inside the solar system. The Ulysses measurements brought this point home to us. So what about the next ice age then? Obviously, the next ice age will happen as the cosmic dynamics causes it to happen, whether we find the timing inconvenient or not. Thus, we can say as often as we want that the startup of the next ice age isn't happening, or won't be happening for a long time yet, and delude ourselves with these beliefs that defy the evidence. The universe isn't responsive to what we wish and say. Its dynamics is responsive to its principles, not to our wishes. What we say or believe in our ignorance won't affect the universe, but it will affect us. It presently keeps us off guard, vulnerable, surprised, fearful, and impotent. Only when we begin to look outside the box of ignorance, searching for evidence, do we find evermore with shock and surprise that the Ice Age startup has already begun, that it is happening with wide-reaching consequences already, and that the first phase is already 45% complete on the entire front, wherever we look. With our eyes open, we can see corresponding evidence everywhere. The weakening plasma sphere around the Sun, for example, is causing ever more and ever larger coronal holes to occur, with corresponding increases in solar cosmic-ray-flux and their effect on the climate on Earth. Back in 2007, when the coronal holes were still rare occurrences, little holes caused headlines. Now, merely 9 years later, when large coronal holes cover nearly the entire face of the Sun, almost nobody raises an eyebrow anymore. With the big changes happening slowly, spread over the space of years, it is easy to lose sight of the larger picture. As a consequence, without an understanding of the principles involved, no serious efforts are being made to respond to the evidence that already exists and is known. We are fascinated instead with small things, while ignoring the big things. On this train of ignoring the big things, society is committing suicide on a grand scale by putting itself asleep at the most critical stage in the history of humanity, when the really big things are unfolding before its very eyes. Thus, with its eyes closed, society ignores the grand downramping in solar activity that began in 1998, which Ulysses had reported, which started the first phase of the Ice Age startup sequence. The grand solar reversal that it reported should have at the very least sparked the recognition that the man-made global warming doctrine is dead, is a dead horse that should be let go. Society equally ignores the grand up-ramping in solar activity that had ended the Little Ice Age with a massive recovery of the Sun, which gave us 300 years of solar global warming, not man-made global warming. By the recognition of the evidence that wasn't hidden, but was right in the open. The man-made global warming horse was a dead horse from the beginning. Ironically, multitudes are still riding this dead horse, unaware that it is dead. Even the Carbon-14 data hasn't caused the recognition yet that the man-made global warming horse is dead, and has been so from its inception. Far too few people are willing to recognize, even today, that it was the massive up-ramping of the Sun that gave us the 300 years of global warming, for which humanity has been vilified and is destroying its economy for. And even fewer people than those are willing to recognize the obvious fact that the solar up-ramping is over, that an immensely fast solar down-ramping has begun, in a near free-fall fashion. The free-fall collapse is evident everywhere. The Sun is down-ramping in a big way. We see a sharp and steady down-ramping in the sunspot cycles, measured and predicted, which makes it rather plain that a major phase shift is happening. And as you can see, the time frame for this happening is extremely short. The upramping of the Sun from the Little Ice Age occurred over a span of 300 years. The downramping that is now in progress promises the reverse action to unfold in a span of only 30 years. That's 10 times faster. The solar downramping is now in progress. That makes it rather plain that the solar cycle 24 will likely be the last one that we will see, with the next phase shift following thereafter. The downramping that we see in solar activity, that is evident in the diminishing sunspot cycles and increasing solar coronal holes, coincide well with the diminishing solar wind pressure that the Ulysses spacecraft had measured. This downramping in solar activity may have been suspected already in the 1960s, when the need to prepare for the next ice age was put on the table in the scientific community at that time. The science voices of reason were tragically scorched in 1974 with the invention of the man-made global warming doctrine and other ugly political objectives. Nevertheless, while the global warming doctrine took the focus away from the real issue still remained and had not been fully buried in the scientific community under the rubble of the hubbub, so it seems, because it was in the 1970s, in the background to all the nasty things, that the Ulysses project was put forward. The need for discovering the truth was evidently still recognized at this time. This meant that the time had come to take a closer look at the Sun from outside the ecliptic plane, from a point in space where the solar wind can be measured unaffected by the heliospheric current sheet that dominates the ecliptic, from where the Sun is commonly observed. The original concept was to fly two spacecraft in opposite directions around the Sun for comparative purposes. One was to be built by the European Space Agency and one by NASA. The NASA spacecraft was later cancelled in 1981. The timing of the cancellation and of the earlier artwork shown here from 1978 suggests that the mission was perceived at some point in the 1970s. The Ulysses mission was perceived in the very decade in which we saw the worldwide startup of anti-science movements. It is unknown how deeply intertwined the inception of the Ulysses mission was with the anti-science project that stood behind the man-made global warming doctrine that was massively promoted to become a worldwide anti-science movement, which it became. The Ulysses mission might have been curtailed and then delayed several times, because by its very nature as a science driver, it flew in opposition to the global warming doctrine. Ironically, the Ulysses mission turned the global warming doctrine into a dead horse completely with its findings, even while the doctrine had been a dead horse from the beginning. The Ulysses mission turned the man-made global warming doctrine into a really dead horse, not so much by its demonstrated conclusion that the rewarming of the Earth after the Little Ice Age had been caused entirely by the upramping of the Sun. No, Ulysses killed the dead horse much more with its concrete evidence that the great warming period is now over, and that a new phase has begun, a phase of rapid solar collapse, that in its free-fall fashion speeds us towards the startup of the next ice age. But much more important than rendering the man-made global warming doctrine a dead horse was the dramatic illustration by Ulysses that the first phase of the startup of the next ice age has begun and is unfolding fast. Ulysses gave us a front row seat in the theater of the first phase of the Ice Age startup. It covered the first 30% of it with its solar wind measurements, with which it enabled us to see for the first time in history that the solar system is collapsing in a free-fall fashion. The 30% diminishment of the solar wind pressure that was measured in just 10 years is akin to a free-fall collapse on the cosmic scale. The solar diminishment at a rate of 30% in 10 years that the Ulysses spacecraft brought home is comparable to a free-fall collapse even in the theater of historic experiences, because nothing of this sort has ever been seen. This is unprecedented. This is gigantic. It is almost unimaginable. No one is prepared for it. Most people simply deny it and banish it from the mind. Nevertheless, it is changing the world. Not only does it render the hydrogen fusion sun theory a dead horse, together with the man-made global warming theory, it also turns a number of prominent economic projects into dead horses that now will never see the light of day, such as the Navapa project and the Bering Strait Tunnel project. The Navapa project is a gigantic civil engineering proposal from the 1960s, from a time when the world was dreaming that its interglacial warm holiday would never end, at least not for a long time. The project is designed to divert the outflow of two major rivers in Alaska backwards into the mountains through the Rocky Mountain Trench across the high plains of the Nevada Great Basin, all the way to the dry southern regions, where irrigation water is critically needed. The project is designed to be gigantic in scope, but is feasible. It is a dead horse now that will never fly. It isn't a dead horse because it would take 50 years to build the project, and because it would be insufficient to meet the ever-growing need for fresh water. It is a dead horse for the simple reason that its feedstock, the northern rivers, would cease to exist long before the project would be completed. This doesn't mean that the freshwater needs of humanity cannot be met. These needs can be met easily with freshwater conveyance afloat in the oceans. Water conveyance through the oceans can be implemented quickly and on the global scale. There is no shortage of fresh water on the planet. The water needs of the world can be met by diverting the outflow of the Amazon River, the Congo River, and the Orinoco River in Venezuela with a trans-ocean pipeline system to wherever water is needed until desalination can fill the need. All of this can be done and be operating before the first phase shift of the Ice Age startup ends. The Bering Strait Tunnel also falls into the category of a dead horse for the same reason. The project is designed as a 50-kilometer-long undersea tunnel that links the Eurasian and American continents with a mass transportation infrastructure. While the project is feasible too, and is economically viable and desirable, it is a dead horse because its location becomes a dead landscape in the near term. This doesn't mean that the idea of building fixed-link transportation channels between the continents is a dead issue. In fact, great fixed links will be built, and they will be built more easily than the Bering Strait Tunnel project would be built. Large-scale floating links between the continents can be constructed with relatively little effort when fully automated large-scale industrial production methods are applied for producing the floating bridge modules, and basalt is used as feedstock, processed with high-temperature nuclear process heat that is applied to melt the basalt for its reshaping into anything. The intercontinental bridges will then also serve as global development backbones for floating agriculture and floating cities along the way. All of this is totally possible. The materials exist, the technologies exist, even the energy resources exist in abundance. These types of development projects will become the horses of the future, and they will fly. These great projects will all be built, and many others like them, not because the Ice Age startup forces us to build them. The option still exists for us to lay ourselves down to die when the Ice Age resumes, as all the human species have done in the past. Instead, I think we will build these infrastructures and many like them, including 6,000 new cities for 1 million people each, because it is amazingly exciting to recognize that we have developed ourselves as human beings to the point that we have the power on hand to do all these things, and to do them with ease, and with joy for one another in honor of the greatest treasure that we have, which is the humanity that we all share. Of course, we will also create ourselves a new renaissance on this path, a renaissance of abundance that will serve us secondarily as a means for meeting the Ice Age challenge, as we have no choice but to be ready for it when it happens. Oh yes, the Ice Age will happen, and will happen soon. The first phase of the startup is already 45% complete. We can't get away from that, but we can move with it, and with a faster pace than that of the solar collapse. We can escape from the areas that the ice will claim, that become ice deserts almost instantly when the third phase of the Ice Age startup unfolds. We can escape from it in time, moved by the knowledge that we now have. We didn't have this knowledge at the time of the Little Ice Age. If the full Ice Age had begun at this time, we wouldn't exist today. We had not the faintest idea in the 1600s how fragile our world had been then, and how devastating the full ice age becomes. We had lived in a climate dream state then. What we had thought to have been big climate changes in the past, which were large enough to affect the course of civilization, do all pale into insignificance in comparison with the full ice age conditions to come. What we face is so immense, according to the ice core records, that the now known facts almost defy our imagination, while they are very real, according to exact scientific measurements obtained from the ice core samples. In fact, we had no comprehension of what we are really facing until the 2000s, when the numerous large ice coring projects were completed in Antarctica and in Greenland, and the measurements of the Ulysses mission revealed features of the sun that weren't even imagined before. Most people see Antarctica and Greenland as relics of a distant past, instead of sentinels of a near future. The great ice desert of Antarctica thus stands more as a proxy for conditions that we need to respond to, which are even now still not fully understood, though far better than they had ever been understood in the past. Much of the continent of Antarctica is presently covered with an ice sheet that is more than 10,000 feet deep, a blanket of eternal ice covered with snow, eternal as it seems. As strange as it may seem, this perception is incorrect. Antarctica hadn't always been an ice desert. For most of its existence, until 35 million years ago, Antarctica was ice-free. That's when the Earth was warmer. The topography of Antarctica at that time may have been similar to what is shown here. Antarctica began to freeze over 35 million years ago, when the Earth began to cool. A while later it thawed out again, as the Earth warmed up for a season. It remained ice-free for roughly another 10 million years, until it froze up again 15 million years ago, and remained frozen from then on, as the Earth continued to cool. The Earth is presently at the coldest state it had been in 440 million years, and it is still getting colder on the larger scene of long-term climate history. During the modern deep cold epoch, termed the Pleistocene epoch, that began 2 million years ago, the great glaciation conditions on the Earth extended a long way from the polar regions into the subtropics, with permafrost conditions reaching all the way south into the regions of today's Beijing, Madrid, Washington, D.C., and possibly Los Angeles. The reasons why these areas are presently ice-free is due to the grand anomalies, termed the interglacial warm periods, with which the Pleistocene deep freeze got interrupted periodically, like with a holiday of wonderful warm climates, such as the one we presently enjoy, which is ending. The warm holiday periods typically last 12,500 years. The current one has lasted 12,800 years. With its ending, history may end, should we fail to respond to the challenge. The entire history of civilization has unfolded during the last 12,800 years of the current warm period that has enabled agriculture to be developed and humanity to become an enormously advanced, productive, and creative people. All of what we call our history has developed in this brief span of the current warm period, so it seems. It is as if no prior history had existed. Now, as we face the end of our warm period, in which our history has unfolded, what we call our history, too, may end. And with this, much of humanity will perish when it enters the coming ice age unprepared. Our existence presently depends on the large-scale agriculture that the current warm period has enabled, which, in an ice age world, will largely cease. We face a choice, therefore. We can choose to lay ourselves down to die with the fading of the current warm epoch, termed the Holocene epoch, by doing nothing to secure our future. Inversely, we can also choose to build the infrastructures that enable us to continue to exist under ice age conditions, when the livable zone on the Earth shrinks to the narrow belt of the tropical zone, as the Earth as a whole becomes radically colder. Thus the question needs to be asked, how much time do we have left to prepare ourselves for what we know is to come, and how harsh will the conditions be? Ironically, until just recently, we had extremely little scientific data available to answer these questions. For this lack, exotic theories for the ice ages have been developed. Even the greatest explorers were severely hampered by this lack of decisive physical evidence. As I said before, the long-standing scientific uncertainty began to fade when the North Greenland Ice Core project reached bedrock in 2003. This 5-year-long drilling project on the Greenland ice sheet had confirmed that the previously discovered large climate fluctuations in ice from the last glacial period, which had been discovered at an earlier drilling site, hundreds of kilometers distant, were not anomalies, but were totally real. Our perception of the world began to change from this point on. We began to see with new eyes. A basis for a new perception became established. The enormously large fluctuations take us from deep glacial conditions to near interglacial conditions in extremely short periods measured in decades. Exotic theories have been invented to rationalize the phenomenon without scientists opening their eyes to consider the sun being the cause for them, which in mainstream science is still regarded as an invariable constant, contrary to all available evidence gleaned in great discoveries. Naturally, the effects that have been discovered are far too enormous for anything but the sun to have caused them. Nevertheless, people have their opinions and like to cling to them. Thus, the new stage of reality that numerous measurements of the sun have literally forced on us still remain largely rejected in the box of consensus mediocrity. The Ulysses Space Mission 2 stands at the forefront of the new stage. It demonstrates the sun to be a plasma sun, emitting solar winds with rapidly changing intensity. It demonstrates the Sun to be a variable star, which a plasma sun necessarily is, by its being externally powered and its being affected by variable external conditions that its dynamics reflect. The Ulysses mission even demonstrated the Sun's connection with the primal fields that focus plasma onto it. It provides us a valuable vista into the plasma flow dynamics in the solar system. Subsequent solar observations in space have added to the basic knowledge of the Sun being a variable star, a plasma star, such as the Solar Dynamics Observatory satellite and the famous SOHO satellites observe the Sun in colors that are invisible to the eye, which technology now makes visible. In applied visible colors, the advanced observatories enable us to see vast dynamics in electromagnetic effects that no eye has ever seen occurring on the Sun or can see. With the aid of advanced telescopes and satellites, we can now visually observe electric dynamics within the plasma sphere surrounding the Sun, and we can see them changing. And as I said before, we can see voids developing in areas of weakened conditions, and we can see the voids getting larger and more frequent in occurrence. We thereby can now literally see the universe in motion, and its ice age start up unfolding. With the recently gained knowledge, we can now also understand the dynamics of the galactic system, in which our solar system is located as a minuscule part of it. We can see our galaxy as but a node point between large and very long intergalactic plasma streams. We see each of the connected plasma streams having its own electric resonance cycle, one with a cycle time of 31 million years per cycle, and the other with a cycle time of 150 million years per cycle. And we can see the two long cycle times overlap each other throughout the galaxy, with its effect on the solar system and the climate on Earth. And we can see thereby our present epoch to be the weakest in 440 million years. We see ourselves existing in such a low-level energy background that glaciation now covers much of the Earth for 85% of the time. We can also see ourselves presently existing in a brief anomaly within the vast ice landscape of the last 2 million years, of which only a quarter is recorded in the ice of Antarctica. And we see ourselves existing entirely within this warm holiday period as if no prior history has existed, because everything prior belongs to a landscape that very few of humanity have previously survived. On this course, we have come to a phase shift in our development as human beings. For the first time ever, in the entire history of our planet, we, humanity, have the capability developed as a living species to live through the ice age cycles unharmed and to prosper by meeting this challenge. We have developed the capability to see into the future that has not yet been, and orient the present towards the future in accord with what we now know. All this is new. This has never happened before in the history of humanity, if not in the history of life itself on this planet. It is truly amazing in the light of all that to realize how tall we now stand as a people in productive capabilities and scientific knowledge, who can live with the dynamics of the universe no matter what the dynamics may turn out to be, including the deep ice ages. In the sight of this realization, it is not scary to note that the first phase of the Ice Age startup is already 45% complete. With the capability that we now have at hand, we are able to transform the world scene from a scene that would normally be scary into an invitation to us all to become fully human, more than we have ever dared to become, or even imagined to be able to. All of this now lays before us as totally realizable. And still the question remains, will we do it? Will we do what is necessary for us all to survive? While the field is rich with evidence that our solar system is in a steep decline, akin to a free-fall collapse, many people still close their eyes and say, nay. They say nay in spite of the evidence, and they say that what has been discovered by many people standing at the leading edge isn't happening. They say that they have their own opinion, their own beliefs, their own axioms. They look their children into the eye and say nay to them, to their future existence, vehemently clinging to axioms that are not real, and often intentionally so. While they close their eyes, they do speak, however, of making discoveries, of discovering the unknown. They hail the concept, theoretically, but then they say nay when the discoveries challenge old opinions. They do this to themselves without ever realizing that by their very nature advanced discoveries bring to light what is new, the discovered facts that bury the old concepts, of which there are many. That's the principle of making discoveries. It is always progressive and leads to astonishing results. Discoveries bring to light aspects that have never been recognized before, which invariably overshadow false prior assumptions. The advanced discoveries enable society to get itself out of the forest of dead horses, the horses that never were viable, that lived only in the imagination of the beholder. Advanced discoveries enable new paradigms that open the door to an unlimited human future. The human quality that enables the making of discoveries and our power to move with them is a feature that is more critical to human existence than most people care to acknowledge. But it is critical for understanding ourselves as an infinite species, and what makes us distinctly human and sets us apart from all other forms of life. The making of advanced discoveries is this human feature that at the present stage has equipped us all as a humanity reaching for the sky to achieve the near impossible by building on the leading-edge discoveries that our collective efforts have brought forth, and to step up from the resulting tall platform to still higher ground, to where we face the Ice Age challenge with a smile and master it as the first people in the history of the world who have dared to do this and have dared to win. We have come a long way forward in our understanding of the nature of the cosmic phenomena that affect our world, when Professor Dr. Zbigniew Jaworowski had warned in his 2003 paper, The Ice Age is Coming, that the end of the current interglacial period is already overdue by 500 years. While he couldn't have known the reason for the delay because the scientific data for it hadn't been available in 2003, he had been right on the mark with his forecasts in almost all respects. His contribution therefore deserves to be honored. He had suggested that a transition to the next ice age could begin at any time and without warning. We know in retrospect that he was right. The transition began in 1998, with fanfares blazing as had been measured in Irkutsk. Professor Jaworowski had also forecast that a transition may unfold over a 50 years period, or a 20 years period. His general estimate matches accurately the combined duration of the first and second phase of the Ice Age startup that we have multiple conclusive evidence for, of which the first phase is in progress and is nearly half complete, which may span slightly more than 30 years. With the second phase being slightly less than 20 years, for a total of 50 years. He also hinted that a really big change could happen over the span of only 1 to 2 years. Modern data suggests that the third phase may actually be a bit shorter. It appears that Dr. Jaworowski had been closer on the mark than he may have realized himself. Still, he didn't spout doom when he made his scientific forecasts, but he did suggest that the time has come to face the future with open eyes and to respond to what is scientifically known and to prepare the world for it. For this, he faced strong opposition from the mainstream, small-minded world. Small-minded thinking is evidently the tallest barrier against our daring to win, which too needs to be recognized and be overcome. The task to prepare the world for the new Ice Age transition has become increasingly critical in recent years, more so than Professor Jaworowski could have recognized in his time. Not only do we see the steep solar collapse happening that he had suspected with his 50 years forecast, we see the collapse also happening towards a potentially much lower minimal background than that of the Little Ice Age at the Maunder minimum. It is not unreasonable, therefore, to assume that the down-ramping of the historic background that began more than 1,000 years ago has continued, so that the third phase of the Ice Age startup will happen in a much weaker solar environment. Current scientific proof projects that the third phase with which the Ice Age begins anew, will happen in the 2050s, with a high degree of scientific certainty. This puts us on a collision course with the astrophysical dynamics. Humanity is rushing into the Ice Age barrier that no one had experienced before, nor can imagine for the lack of historic experiences. Is anyone prepared for the great shock? The terminology barrier and shock has a familiar ring to it. A sound barrier had once been envisioned that was deemed to make supersonic flight impossible. Attempts to break the barrier had caused many an aircraft to be ripped apart by the resulting shock waves. The air is a fluid. It normally flows around an aircraft. It slips out of its way. But when an aircraft is pushed forward faster than the air can move out of the way, the normally operating principles of fluid dynamics no longer apply. The air becomes compressed so rapidly that it cannot escape. Things become chaotic at this point. An enormous amount of pressure builds up by the relentless compression. The building up pressure would tear the aircraft apart if the universe hadn't created an alternate principle that comes into play in such situations. Under the rescue principle, the building up pressure is transformed into a type of high-energy wave that escapes sideways in the form of an intense shock wave that expands multiple times faster than the speed of sound. The shock wave expands so fast that the shock front moves almost abreast with the vehicle or aircraft that causes the shock wave. At higher supersonic speeds, an aircraft flies directly into its own shock wave, by which it becomes easily damaged. Many have evidently crashed. As a consequence, the speed of sound had been recognized once as a limiting barrier. As it was, the perceived sound barrier was soon broken in the minds of alert scientists who corrected their approach to aircraft design. It became recognized that new physical principles come into play when the flight of an object in the fluid of air exceeds the speed of the fluid's propagation wave, which determines the speed of sound. It was discovered that higher-level principles apply in these extreme circumstances that cannot be observed in slow flight. This scientific recognition paved the way to improved aircraft designs that keep the aircraft operating safely in the shadow of the destructive shock wave. By the resulting advanced perceptions of the dynamics involved, the sound barrier became reduced to nothing more than just an engineering challenge. Eventually, the challenge was so effectively overcome with the appropriate efforts that nobody talks about the sound speed barrier any longer. Hypersonic aircraft has since been flown that exceed the speed of sound multifold. The aircraft shown here can exceed the speed of sound sevenfold. With advanced scientific understanding, aircraft engineers are now able to develop designs that were once deemed totally impossible, according to the nature of the then known fundamental physics. The created supersonic marvels became tactical aircraft, like the Blackbird shown here, that is capable of 3 times the speed of sound, of which 32 were built, and only 12 were lost in accidents during its 30 years of active missions. It has been amply demonstrated that it hadn't been the universe that had stood in the way of breaking the sound speed barrier, that it had instead been the prevailing narrow perception that had once erected a formidable barrier. The barrier had been created by a false concept of the laws of the universe. The breakthrough that resulted is generally regarded as a great victory in aviation engineering. Oh, it was that. The Concorde became the most successful supersonic transport in aviation history. It flew for 27 years. One of the aircraft had logged over 22,000 hours of flight when it was retired in the year 2000. What had started as a dream had become reality. Was the achievement recklessly won? Some who dare to win in this field, who put their life on the line in exploring the unknown along the way, have developed a saying that if it isn't dangerous, it is not worth doing. The Concorde flew on the culmination of 25 years of research and development efforts, trials and errors, breaking down barriers, and some with sheer daring. But can we apply this type of high-risk attitude that has brought the marvelous successes to our meeting the Ice Age challenge? The presently ongoing almost free-fall collapse of the solar system that is evident in numerous ways should be forcing a phase shift in society's perception and its response to it towards a risk-free approach. Risk-free, and this means risk-free in relocating entire large nations into the tropics. Risk-free also means to get started in time so that the task can be actually completed in the 30 years we may have remaining. The Concorde proved that immense barriers can be overcome if we care to do so. But can we inspire us to care for one another universally to such a high degree, or even enough to get started individually? It is here where the future presently looks dim. The Ice Age challenge is similar to the challenge of breaking the sound speed barrier and building the Concorde all rolled into one and in record time, while the rider in this case is the whole of humanity. The old approach of, let's try it and see what happens, is no longer justifiable because of the consequences involved. Science is projecting a world with a 70% cooler and dimmer sun. The current wait and see and do nothing attitude amounts to a near certain death sentence for almost everyone who expects to be alive in the 2050s, including all the children yet to be born. The dynamics of the universe has placed our world onto a collision course with a shock point that ushers in a new reality that no one has experienced before. A totally changed world lies before us when the sun's radiated energy is reduced by 70%. At the shock point, agriculture, as we know it, ends. And with it ends the food supply for humanity. That's what humanity is presently rushing into, blindfolded, without care, by which it is doomed. The doom can be avoided when society begins to live with open eyes, by which new agriculture is developed for the new reality and is placed in areas where agriculture remains viable. But who is willing to dare to go that far? Living with open eyes means that it would impel a fundamental change in the design of civilization, a change to match the changing cosmic dynamics and their consequences for human living. The relocation of all nations from outside the tropics into the tropics likely requires the building of 6,000 new cities for 1 million people each, together with new agriculture for them, and most of it staged afloat on the sea for the lack of available land in the tropics. The task is so vast in scope that it requires a new design for civilization, economics, finance, culture, and the self-perception of humanity. And the time for that is running short. But nothing is happening, nothing is moving, nothing is done. The challenge is not even acknowledged. Zbigniew Jaworowski, a man with 50 years of experience and with standing and clout in the scientific community, has nevertheless failed to inspire a movement in the sciences and in society to have people open their eyes. While the redesign of civilization is still possible, the window of opportunity for action is closing fast. It takes decades to build 6,000 new cities and to create new agriculture for them. We may have only 30 years left for this, and that's not for getting started, but to have the project completed. Obviously, nothing gets completed if we don't get started. The infrastructures for breaking the Ice Age barrier can be built. The redesign of economics is possible for this to happen. For supersonic flight, the infrastructures were implemented eagerly in the form of design changes. In economics, the necessary infrastructures needs to be a platform that rises far above the chokehold of monetarism, and with a daring to win that raises the value of human life to such high levels of value that the recognition of this great value inspires the means for its protection. Nothing less will be enough for humanity to survive. So far, too little is being done. The barriers are protected instead of humanity. Society is presently committed by narrow-minded perceptions to smash its world ship with hypersonic speed into the next ice age, without the slightest preparations for it. We rush into this with nothing prepared that would break the impending doom that will kill us all with few exceptions. To achieve supersonic flight was a matter of choice. The overcoming of the Ice Age barrier with world development is likewise a matter of choice. The difference lies in the consequences. We could have lived perfectly well without breaking the sound speed barrier in avionics, while almost no one will survive without humanity breaking the Ice Age barrier in its mind in all its numerous aspects, and get started with building the infrastructures for it while we still can. The bottom line is, we have no choice in this matter. This doesn't mean that the future of humanity is grim. It only means that a decisive choice needs to be made in society for it to become more fully human. That's what it means to dare to win. It means that we find value in human existence, enough to keep the whole of humanity alive, no matter what it takes. It requires the whole of humanity working as one hand to build the infrastructures for a new world for human living in the tropics. The failing to rouse ourselves to the task is synonymous with the intention to commit suicide. Inversely, should we thus dare to win and make the breakthroughs, the brightest future will unfold before us with the greatest scientific, economic, cultural and creative renaissance ever imagined, for which the potential is already in our hand. Ultimately, it doesn't matter what specific theory we apply for the cause of the Ice Age. The physical evidence that we have already recognized should be enough to spring us into action. We see the long down-ramping in solar activity starting more than 1,000 years ago. We see the massive up-ramping of the sun for 300 years that warmed the Earth and ended the Little Ice Age. And we see the free-fall collapse of the sun towards a weaker background than we had at the time of the Little Ice Age. These physical measurements are measurements of the state of the world, no matter what theory one may apply for them. The bottom line is, our house is collapsing. It is time to build a better one. That's the shape of our dominion over the solar system, with which we have the power to say to the fast collapsing system, we can live with that. The specific theories only come into play for reasoning out why the solar system is collapsing. The fact that it is collapsing is no longer a mere academic theory. It is measured reality. And the destination, too, is measured reality. We have numerous measurements made by leading-edge teams that tell us unmistakably what the world past the Ice Age startup looks like. The theories only flesh out the details that stand behind the measurements, that relate to specifics of what we have to face and what we are dealing with. The color barrier is an example of where the theories can aid us. They can aid us with breaking the barrier in the mind. The color barrier is a part of the mental barrier that bars the recognition of 99.999% of the mass of the universe that exists in the form of plasma instead of as atomic elements. This recognition is useful in recognizing the type of challenge that the Ice Age imposes, such as the recognition that the radiated solar energy will diminish by roughly 70%, from which the Ice Age conditions do result. The color barrier is significant in this context as a secondary type barrier in the mind. For example, if one was asked how many colors can be seen in the rainbow, one would answer 7, because that's what one sees in the rainbow. The answer is important, as it proves that the sun cannot be a sphere of hydrogen gas heated by nuclear fusion from within, because if it was, one would see only 3 colors according to the hydrogen atom's emission spectrum. But that's not what we see. The sunlight that we see consists of a seamless spectrum of colors. This tells us that the sunlight is the composite of the emission spectra of a wide range of atomic elements, all emitting light with different spectra at the solar surface where the sunlight is produced. The only physical process that makes this complex composite possible is the process of plasma-powered stellar nucleosynthesis happening on the surface of the sun. That's a phenomenon that the hydrogen fusion sun theory cannot facilitate. With this recognition, we mentally break away from a major long-standing barrier in the mind and begin to acknowledge what is actually real, for which the plasma sun concept is the leading candidate and the only one for which scientific evidence actually exists. Attempts have been made to rescue the archaic hydrogen sun theory by assuming that nucleosynthesis is occurring within the hydrogen sun, primarily near its core, where heavy elements are said to be formed, ranging all the way up to iron, including oxygen and carbon along the way. The attempt to rescue the old hydrogen fusion sun theory breaks down by the fact that the synthesized heavy atomic elements would be gravitationally drawn to the core of that sun and create an immensely heavy core there, for which no evidence exists, instead of the heavy elements being lofted into the solar surface to enrich the spectrum of sunlight there, which even then would be still insufficient to match the spectrum that we actually see. The sunlight paradox is a part of the Mendel barrier in cosmology that bars the recognition of the role of plasma in the universe. The barrier, which is a barrier in the mind, renders all observed phenomena as the effect of gravitational attraction, because when one denies the existence of plasma and its vast range of electrodynamic effects and their effect in the universe, then gravitational attraction is all that one has left to work with and is allowed to acknowledge. This adds up to a huge barrier. The barrier bars the recognition of 99.999% of the actual mass of the universe and its 39 orders of magnitude stronger electromagnetic effects in comparison with the effects of gravity. The resulting Mendel barrier thereby causes a wide skein of science delusions, but nothing more than that. The mental barrier doesn't change the weight of the physical measurements of the ongoing collapse of the solar system. The mental barrier fulfills a specific purpose of a more general nature. Mental barriers have an intention standing behind them, for which they have been created. This is evidently so, because barriers in the mind are not a natural feature of humanity. History tells us that the barriers were created by intention and result from the long-standing political objective that requires science devolution in the defense of the systems of empire. The intention for science devolution has been openly stated in numerous ways, going back centuries in some cases. A phase shift in thinking becomes necessary, therefore, to cause a breakout from the artificial barriers. Some evidence exists that this type of breakout, too, may have already begun. The concession that has been made with the proposition that nucleosynthesis is occurring within the hydrogen sun is a significant step away from the Big Bang theory of primordial nucleosynthesis. That's a big step forward. The next step forward is a step towards the recognition of the plasma sun and its full range of nucleosynthesis with the fusion of plasma in surface reactions, where the conditions exist for such creative fusion to happen as we see evident in the sunlight. Thus, slowly as it may be, one by one the mental barriers fall, from the most simple to the most complex that have ever been built up over the centuries. And as the barriers fall, the joy that one feels with seeing the barriers to disappear is a significant element on the critical path before us of our daring to win.